Hello everyone. In today's video, we are going to talk about how to break the data, which is our Harry Potter novels, into chapters. The benefit of breaking our data into chapters will be more clear in a later video, but basically, the reason we want to break our data into chapters is simply because it makes more sense to analyze our data based on chapters, and if we want to compare different attributes or characteristics of each chapter, it will be very easy to do so. So let's get started. Okay, first thing is, what do I mean by break data into chapters? I simply means that instead of having one single file that has all the contents from book 1 to book 7, we want to convert this single file into something that looks like this. So each chapter will has its own file, and that's basically what I mean by break data into chapters. Another thing that we will do is we will also combine all lines into one long string. So what do I mean by that? Currently our data has this format which is given by lines. So at the end of each line there is implicitly a new line characters. I don't want that. I want to convert this to this so that within each chapter everything becomes a one very long string. Again, the benefit of doing this will be more clear in a later video, but basically it will help us to analyze the data without having all those new line characters between our contents. Now, after understanding what needs to be done, the first step is for each chapter we need to identify where does it start and where does it end. So I'm going to create two lists. First list is called chapter start line. This tells me for each chapter where is its starting line. And then another list is called chapter end line. This also tells me for each chapter where does that chapter end. So for example, in chapter 1 it will start at line number 1 and then ends at line number 544. For the second chapter, it will start at line 546 and then ends at line 957, etc. So after I'm getting those two lists, then it will be very straightforward for me to query the specific lines for each chapters and then write those lines into individual files. Okay, then the next question is, how can we produce these two lists? Basically, we need to loop through chapter names and the data. So I have created a file which has all the chapter names. Each line has a book number followed by the chapter number and then the chapter names. We also need to loop through our data, which is our novel, ebook from book 1 to book 7. So the first step is to grab the first chapter name and then start looping through the data until we find this first chapter name. Once we find the first chapter, then the next line is the chapter starting line. So we can record that into our list and we can repeat this process. After we find out the location of the first chapter name, we can grab the second chapter name. And now we will loop through the data until we find the second chapter name again. However, this time we don't need to start from the beginning. We will start from where we left last time. And once we found the second chapter name, the next line is the second chapter start line. And also the previous line is the first chapter end line. So we repeat this process until the very last chapter. Again, once we found the chapter name, the very next line is where the chapter starts. And because this is the last chapter, where the chapter ends is simply the very last line of the entire data. After understanding how to break our data into chapters, let's talk about how to combine all lines into one single long string. In order to do that, we can simply loop through each line of our data and replace the new line characters, which is \n with a white space. So this is the syntax for that. in a for loop, we are going to loop through our data. Each line of the data, we are going to replace any new line characters with a white space. This is a good idea and will work for all cases except for one special case. And this one special case is when the line ends with a hyphen. So let me give you an example. Over here, on the second line, all these you know who nonsense, because this second line ends with hyphen followed by a new line characters. If we simply replace the new line character with a white space, after we return that to a new file, the result will be something that looks like this. U hyphen and then there will be a white space, no hyphen who, and this is not the result we want. So in this special case, when the line ends with hyphen, we are not going to replace the new line character with a white space. We are simply going to delete the new line character and that's it. So if the line ends with hyphen followed by a new line characters, we will replace this hyphen new line character with simply a hyphen. Okay, in all other cases, we will replace the new line character with a white space. Before we are going to the Python code, I want to briefly talk about the difference between hyphen and dash. So dash usually are represented by a longer horizontal bar versus hyphen, which is usually represented by a shorter bar. So the hyphen is used to show that what it is attached to does not make up a complete word by itself. It just simply means that hyphen are used to connect multiple words into one single entity. So a hyphen is usually surrounded by two words at both ends. For example, you know who, good for nothing, etc. On the other hand, the dash, also called the M dash, is a longer version of a hyphen. A pair of dashes separates a strong interruption from the rest of the sentence, and a dash is usually surrounded by two white spaces. So I'm giving two examples here. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, there's a dash here to represent an interruption from the rest of the sentence, and it didn't improve his mood. Was the tabby cat he'd spot that morning. Here is a second example. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. So of course, if this interruption is at the end of the sentence, then you will just have a dash. If the interruption is in the middle of a sentence, then you will surround this interruption by two dash. And then the dash is usually preceded by a white space and then also followed by a white space. After understanding all the logics and what needs to be done, let's go into the code and see how we can implement this in Python. So first, I'm going to read the two documents. First document is our Harry Potter novel, and the second document is the one that has all the chapter names. So first thing to do is that we need to find out the start and end line indices for each chapters. Again, this will be the end result. We will need to produce a list that has all the chapter start line, another list that has all the chapter end lines. But before the process, chapter start line will be initialized as an empty string. Chapter end line will also be initialized as an empty string. There is also another variable called iteration index. It's initialized to be 0. So this variable basically keeps track where we are in our data set. As I mentioned before, when we loop through our data set, we don't always loop from the very beginning. We can simply loop from where we left last time. And this iteration index is how I'm tracking where we are left last time. There will be an outer loop and an inner loop. Outer loop basically loops through our chapter names. Chapter name starts from character with index number 5. This is because the first 4 characters are book number and chapter number, followed by white space. So the chapter name actually starts from character number 5 all the way to the end. and I'm saving that into this chapter name. Okay, after we grab the chapter name, we are going to loop through our dataset to find out the location of this chapter name. And we are not going to loop through the entire dataset every time. We just need to start from where we left last time. So it will just be iteration index all the way to the end of the file. And we need to make sure that start equals to iteration index. If we don't specify that, then the counter of this enumerate function will always start with 0, which is not we want. Okay, we loop through the data until we find out the line that equals to our chapter name. Once we hit that condition, then we know that the chapter start line is the very next line, which is IDX plus 1. So we can append that into our list. And then also the end line of the previous chapter is simply the IDX minus 1. So we can also append that into this chapter end line list. But we need to skip the first chapter because when we hit the first chapter, we do not know the end line of the first chapter yet. It's only when we hit the second chapter, we know the chapter end line of the first chapter. So we need to skip the first chapter, and the logic I'm using here is simply skip whenever IDX is equal to 0. So we are only going to implement this when IDX is not equal to 0. If IDX is equal to 0, meaning that we are just hitting the first chapter names, and we will skip that. When IDX is not equal to 0, then we will start appending the chapter end line. Okay, after that, we will update this iteration index to be the next line, and we will break out from this inner loop and then start from the outer loop all over again. And because we already update this iteration index, next time when we get into this inner loop, we are not going to loop from the very beginning. We are just going to loop starting from this iteration index all the way to the end of the file and then start all over again. And then very lastly, after we complete all this inner loop and outer loop, we need to append the end line for the very last chapter, which is simply the number of lines minus 1. In Python, index start with 0, so we need to make sure that we are minus 1 to get the index of the very last line. Okay, after we find out this chapter start line and chapter end line, let's work on remove the new line special characters. So very simple, we are going to loop through our lines. If the line is ended with hyphen followed by a new line characters, then we will simply replace everything with just hyphen. Otherwise, we will simply replace the new line character with a white space. Now we are ready to write out each chapter as a single text file. In order to do that, we are going to loop through this chapter name file, which is this one over here. And every time we loop through that, we are going to also grab the chapter start index and chapter end index, which is given by this chapter start line list and this chapter end line list. The chapter name in this case will start from the very beginning. This is because I'm going to use this chapter name as my file name, and in this time I want the book number and chapter number to be part of my file name. So we need to have everything start from beginning, but we don't want the very last character, which is actually the new line characters. So it will start from very beginning all the way to -1. And if you look at my directory, I'm creating a subdirectory called Harry Potter chapters. And then within this subdirectory, I'm going to have the chapter names .txt. And then start writing each chapters from this chapter start index all the way to chapter end index +1, and then use these write functions to write all the lines into the file. And let's look at the result. On this default directory, there is a Harry Potter chapters that I created. We are creating a file for each chapters, and each chapter has a book number and chapter number followed by the chapter name. Everything becomes a long string. Okay, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy so far. If you do, please like my video and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you have any questions. Other than that, I will see you in my next video. Thank you.